I went in and received a presentation from some people that I cannot name, but they're here in the United States, and they showed me where there was a request to launch a cruise missile at a building, and this was in, let's just say, north central Ukraine, in a city, because the Ukrainians had placed crew-served weapons, that is, missiles and artillery into this building. They couldn't get at it from the ground. They couldn't strike it effectively. And so within 10 minutes, a cruise missile was launched from the Black Sea Fleet and destroyed that target. Well, we can't do that. We're not set up for that.
Welcome to the New World. Thorough conversations in times of change. My name is Adrian Verbrugge, and today I visit Colonel Douglas Macgregor. He's a decorated combat veteran in the US Army and former senior advisor of the Secretary of Defense under Donald Trump. We're here in Orlando in the studio of Our Country, Our Choice. And it's really a pleasure and an honor talking to you, Mr. Macgregor.
Well, welcome to Orlando. Please call me Doug or Doug.
Okay, thanks. The topic of today is very serious. We're going to talk about war and the future of the West. But I want to start with the war, because in the beginning of your book, you mentioned von Clausewitz, the famous Prussian, was it a general, I think?
Oh, he was a general in the Russian army.
In the Russian army?
Major general in the Russian army.
Yeah.
He served the Tsar after Prussia was occupied by the French.
Yeah, you mentioned the three types of war. He speaks of a war of decision, and Scheidung in German, I think, a war of choice, right, and a war of observance.
Well, he talks really about wars of observation, which would qualify today in our parlance as wars of choice. Okay. Because his argument is that the war of observation is not a war that is existential for the state. It's something that the state can choose to fight, but whether or not the state actually wins it is not really relevant because it's not a major war. A war of decision involves the life of the state and the people. Yeah. You know, he talked about state, army, and people. And a war of decision involves those three things and their very existence.
Now you can say when you read your book, there, of course, you make use of this distinction, but at the same time you discuss different layers of a conflict. Yes. And I would say even different kinds of wars that are going on in right now. So I want to start with first and taking a look at the current conflicts we're in, especially the war in Ukraine, because it has a lot of my interest as well. Mm-hmm. And then ask the question, what kind of war the different participants are fighting right now? So, because we have this idea about Russia, we have maybe an idea about ourselves. I don't know exactly what idea Europe has, but let's get into that. What in your view, is the central idea, and what is the strategy and that is behind the Putin's or the Russia's war at the moment?
Well, thank you for, first of all, inviting me to meet with you, and thank you for asking these questions because they're so rarely asked. What we get through the media is very superficial. The first thing I think we need to understand, which is a point you've actually made, is that armies, military establishments, are composed of flesh and blood. We seem to forget that, particularly in the United States. We tend to think in terms of technology and money. We lose sight of the human factor.
That's also the cultural factor.
Yes, and with the human factor comes everything. You know, the history, the culture, the experience, all of those things are brought to bear on a military establishment in the event of a conflict or a war. And right now, what's happening in Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine primarily, is not really well understood in the West. Putin, sees this particular conflict as an existential conflict for Russia. In other words, for him...
A war of decision.
Yes, it's a war of decision. Yeah. This is on his border. Yeah. And he had been talking for 20 years about his concern with what was happening on his border in the West.
Yeah, Munich, 2008.
Right.
Yeah.
And he kept saying, under no circumstances can Ukraine become part of NATO, because whether you think so or not, we still regard NATO as potentially hostile. Remember, the Russians asked the question, we disassembled the Warsaw Pact. We left Eastern Europe, and we did so because you promised not to follow. In other words, not to fill the vacuum that we'd left behind, and ultimately not to threaten us in any way. It was very obvious to him in the first part of the 21st century that Ukraine was being used as a potential battering ram against Russia, or what was left of Russia. That Ukraine, which had been part of Russia for centuries off and on, was also part of the Polish-Lithuanian Empire. It had changed sides, borders, populations changed, but always it was very important what happened in Ukraine. It was the traditional route of invasion, and there was always fertile ground in Ukraine for anti-Russian sentiment, particularly in Western Ukraine. So he was acutely sensitive to all of this, and then watched what we were doing, and he kept saying, don't do this, don't do this. Don't do this.
But you also mean that this anti-Russian sentiment that was in Ukraine would imply that in case Ukraine became part of NATO, then the anti-Russian sentiments in NATO itself would become this a dangerous mix together with this anti-Russian sentiments in Ukraine.
Let's keep in mind, the Russians are not fools.
No.
I mean, everyone who lives in Eastern Europe knows the history for the last several hundred years, and some would go back 1,000. So it's no mystery that the Poles don't like Russians, and that there is a mutual suspicion there. You have similar feelings in the Baltic states, and the Russians also know there are good reasons for those feelings. Yeah. And they have bent over backwards since the dissolution of the Soviet Union to try and demonstrate that they are not like the Soviet Union. And we forget the enormously consequential economic collapse inside Russia that set Russia back decades, effectively.
Putin, in the 90s, you mean?
Yes.
Under Yeltsin. Yeah.
And Putin has spent a great deal of his time trying to recover that, rebuild the standard of living, improve prosperity, and has spent surprisingly little on the Russian defense establishment, which is one of the reasons when the war begins and he moves relatively few forces into eastern Ukraine, people are shocked. I was surprised because I knew that the force was small, but I was surprised at how he went about this, and suddenly became very clear he's got a small army. He doesn't have the punch, the ability to do what we are accustomed to seeing the Russians do. And it's interesting to me to listen to people in the West who castigated the quality of the Russian army and its smallness and so forth, arguing, well, see, there's nothing to fear and this could always be defeated. And that was behind the scenes what Washington continued to tell Ukrainians. And we put effectively a puppet regime into power in Kiev that was pro-Western and anti-Russian. And we threw the anti-Russian regime in Kiev out. We used our Ukrainian allies to do that, but that's effectively what we did. And then we began to see election after election, and you could always see the electoral map, and you saw that everyone who was east of the Dnieper River and part of the northern portion that touched Belarusia, all the way down and through Crimea, was always pro-Russian. And west of the river tended to vote, on the whole, in support of the Western perspective, the Western orientation, and wanted to divorce itself from Russia. And in 2014, I was interviewed on RT, and I asked them to put the electoral maps up, and they said, so what is your point? The point is, there should be a referendum. Let these people vote themselves out of one country and into another if that's what they want to do. And I said, we should facilitate this. This is what OSCE exists to do. This is what we as Americans should be interested in. Let these people govern themselves as they see fit. And clearly, one side is unambiguously Russian, the other is not.
I had a conversation with Nikolai Petro just the other day, and he talked about the history of this inner conflict within Ukraine, and it's very important to it.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to the 1700s, you're dealing with Charles XII of Sweden, and you have left bank, right bank Cossacks. Yeah. You have Cossacks fighting with the Russians and Cossacks fighting against the Russians. That reaches all the way up through World War II. But the point is, let's just acknowledge this exists and have a referendum. Well, then I was pilloried and attacked on the Hill that, the Ukrainian territorial integrity must remain unchanged. And of course, by now, the Russians, fearing they would have a NATO naval base in Crimea, had already invaded and seized Crimea.
Let's get back to where you started. He said the motives of Putin, and then later on we'll discuss the situation in Ukraine. But you say it's an existential war for Russia, and the West had promised not to move 1 inch to the east. In fact, we did, and it became a kind of a strategy just to enclose Russia and even to make the Crimean harbor a Ukrainian harbor. Let's say that a harbor that would become part of NATO in the end. So so one of its reasons is that from a Russian perspective, that this whole development tended in a direction in which Russia would be isolated, not having any warm water harbor anymore.
Well, I don't think that was as big of an issue for Putin as losing control of Crimea and effectively ceding the Black Sea to NATO.
Yes.
The Black Sea is to the Russians essentially what the Great Lakes are to the United States. If you moved a foreign flotilla down the St. Lawrence Seaway and into Lake Erie, we'd be up in arms. Yeah. We also look at the Caribbean as a lake.
It was experienced simply as a part of Russia, part of its culture, so even without the military relevance, it was a part of their domain, you say?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, they fought hundreds of years to drive out the Turks, the Mongols, and the Tartars. All had to be driven out because initially all of those peoples were surrounded the Black Sea. And they were hostile to Russia. They were Muslim. And the czars fought off and on all the way up through Catherine the Great. She finally gets control of Crimea in 1776. But the other thing that was happening in eastern Ukraine that we need to keep in mind is it wasn't simply, well, if the Ukrainians want to join NATO, they can do so. We were building a Ukrainian army deliberately in eastern Ukraine for one purpose and only one purpose, to attack Russia.
And then that happened since 2014.
Yes, absolutely. Well, we had already provided assistance in various forms, but it became a major focus for us to build a new Ukrainian army on the NATO model.
That's a really important point, because we're talking now, obviously, of the NATO support and the support of Europe and America to the Ukrainian defense force. But there was the involvement of NATO was already going on, and in what sense? In what we were doing at the
So we see this army emerge ostensibly for the purpose of seizing control or regaining control of Crimea. This massive force of over 400,000, I think, was.
And how big was that support at the time, from 2014? In billions? Have you any idea?
Billions of dollars coming out of the United States and NATO countries, particularly Germany and Great Britain and France. I don't know what the Dutch contributed, but there was a NATO program, obviously led by us, to create a brand new NATO army inside Ukraine that was unambiguously offensive in orientation. Now, at the same time, they began building these extensive defenses that would be behind them, that they felt they were going to need in the future, which has turned out to be accurate. But more important, they also were attacking Donetsk and Luhansk. And between 2014 and 2022, when this war breaks out with the Russian intervention on the 22nd of February, there were more than 14,000 people in Luhansk and Donetsk killed by Ukrainian military action. No one ever brings that up. Most of these people were just Russians that lived there. They were not even so-called militias, Russian militias. Yeah. And yes, Putin was under a lot of pressure at home to do things for those people in Luhansk and Donetsk who, after all, were Russians. So
was it artillery fire?
Mostly artillery, but there were some ground assaults into the areas. And the point is that they were considered breakaway provinces, and these Ukrainian forces were being built to retake them and then launch against Crimea. And when they talked about Luhansk and Donetsk, they talked about the beginnings of ethnic cleansing. We're just going to drive all the Russians out, get rid of all the Russians. Remember, this is at a point in time where the Russians were already second or third class citizens in Ukraine anyway, which is why these Minsk Accords eventually are set up, which turned out to be irrelevant and an empty facade. But the point is...
even Angela Merkel later on said it was only to spare some time, buy time.
To build the army.
Yeah. How big was the army at the time, you think, in 2000?
Well, when they came in, it was over about 240,000, but they went up to over 400,000 because these were reserves.
Yeah.
So the combination was over 400,000.
It was a serious army.
Yes, it was a very good army, very well trained, had lots of equipment. And when the Russians went in, they only actually had initially on the ground in Ukraine, in that part of Ukraine, only about 90,000 troops.
But what was Putin thinking at the time? I mean, he saw this serious buildup of an army, but then he comes in with an army of 100,000 soldiers. In a strange way, there was not first an air fight or something like that. He just went in and...
Listen, you're asking critical questions, and I'm sure we'll know the absolute facts, but let's back up and talk about what...
Did you understand?
Oh, yes, yeah, I do now. I did not at the time.
Okay.
Neither did the Russians. Okay, and we have to understand this. When he first went in, I think he thought this was his opportunity to signal to us how serious he was, as though we were going to suddenly change our approach and take him seriously. He completely misjudged this.
Yeah.
Putin is someone that has always been of, major Russian figures, probably the single most Western-oriented or pro-Western leader of the bunch. Very much so.
Yeah, he lived in Germany for...
Yes, he did. You'd have to go back to the late 19th century, early 20th century to find Russian czars who had the kind of positive view of the West that he does, or did. And I think this was part of the problem. He assumed that we would react. Well, he didn't understand that our view of the Russians was completely skewed in favor of the Russians are weak, the Russians are corrupt, the Russians are stupid, the Russians are incapable. I mean, just go down the list. This is really what people in Washington thought. And I remember having conversations with some of them in these think tanks, and I tried to tell this one gentleman who's very prominent, you see him from time to time on YouTube and television, and I said, don't you understand? The Russian military is not the same as Western militaries. You may look at them and say, well, they don't seem to be quite as polished. They don't seem to be as well-equipped or well-fitted in their uniforms and so forth. Those things are superficial. The Russian army has always had this sort of loose-looking soldier. And it's always had large numbers of non-Russians with it. Units of Uzbeks and units of Chechens and others. This is not new.
Yeah, this is their history.
This is their history. I said, don't reach the wrong conclusions and don't assume that these people aren't going to fight for their country. Well, they're the ones who invaded. But from the standpoint of Putin, once he gets into Ukraine, what he thought was a problem is infinitely greater. Once they get into eastern Ukraine, not only do they find this monstrous Ukrainian army for which he was unprepared, he also finds the biolab.
But is the intelligence on both sides failing at the time?
Yeah, I think so. I think both sides misinterpreted and misread things. No question about it.
But how is that possible? Because there has always been a good relation between the Russian and the Ukrainians. He must have had spies or something like that.
Well, there's two things going on here. Yes, the Ukrainians and the Russians have cooperated and gotten along from time to time. They also haven't. And as we built this army up, we began essentially stoking the fires of the Second World War. Remember, not an estimated 9 million Ukrainian lives, probably 2 more million Russians as well that never are mentioned, but 9 million Ukrainians were systematically murdered between 1929 and 1933. The man who did it was in the NKVD. His name was Yagoda, and he and his NKVD officers went in there after they'd emptied prisons inside Russia and brought convicts with them because the convicts could be relied upon to rape and murder and steal whatever they found, which is what they wanted to do. They were there to destroy what they said was the Ukrainian, what we would say is middle class, but in reality, these people took the opportunity to effectively destroy Ukraine.
Are you referring to the Holodomor?
Yes, yeah. And this also
the farmers.
But there's a cultural.
This is the wound in Ukraine.
Oh yeah, terrible. And this is one of the reasons why there were so many Ukrainians, and then later on many Russians as well, who went over to the Germans. This is something we don't talk about. But they began stoking these old fires. And there were always people in Western Ukraine who were enamored of National Socialism. And these symbols started showing up. And of course, this was done to aggravate the Russians on the one hand, but also to create the illusion that this was a new, superior army on the model of the German force.
You're referring to the Azov regiment, for example.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of them.
And these things were funded by, at the time, Kolomoisky, who was Jewish. And remember, we had this man, Zelensky, who was Jewish. So you had the juxtaposition of, on the one hand, these symbols of hate and murder.
Even Nazism.
On
the one hand.
And all these Jews who are in prominent roles inside Ukraine and inside the government. It's bizarre. It makes no sense. But when you look at what they're interested in, the people who are running the country were interested in anything that would mobilize Ukrainians against Russians. And just as we in the United States are easily taken in by these unsophisticated depictions of the Soviet enemy 30 or 40 years ago and transposing that old picture of the enemy onto Russia, we're easily beguiled by that in the United States because we've been listening to bad people speak with Russian accents on television for decades. You had something similar happen in Ukraine.
But let's get back to the army itself. My question is, how come that the intelligence on both sides was failing?
I think there are two things that have to be taken into account because I've seen it happen here. It may be that President Putin received different kinds of intelligence assessments, and he picked and chose what he thought was appropriate. I have to take that into consideration.
Kind of wishful thinking.
I think President Putin is probably the single most adult and clear-thinking man in Europe and the world today.
And very prudent in a way.
And very prudent. But on this occasion, I think he grossly misjudged the West, and I think he misjudged what was going on. It was even worse than he thought. Because remember, in his mind, he was expecting any day that these Pershing II missiles from the 1980s that were banned under the INF, that we now call them Standard missiles, but they're very powerful and very quick, that those would show up in eastern Ukraine. And that would place them within minutes of striking the Russian nuclear deterrent and destroy their early warning system and so forth. That's what he was worried about. But he didn't. When he gets in there, he finds out this Ukrainian army is actually exceptionally good. It's not perfect, but it's damn good. And they have to make a decision after about several months. What are we going to do? And remember, they tried in Istanbul, and they thought they had an agreement because the keystone in the agreement was neutrality for Ukraine. And at that point, he was ready to back out of Ukraine. And that brings up something else that's interesting. When the Russian forces first entered eastern Ukraine, they encountered lots of Russians. Obviously, the people there were Russian. And they said, well, thank God you've come. And then the people said, well, what are you going to do? Well, we're just here to, push the Ukrainians back and then get a deal. And then we'll leave. And the Russian people there said, if you're going to leave, then the Ukrainian secret police will come back and put bullets in all of our heads. So many of them said, the hell with you. We're not going to support you. If you're not here to liberate us and protect us,
you're not here to stay.
Go home, literally, these conversations were held. This was reported back to Putin. This is where Putin begins to realize he's dealing with a different animal from what he initially thought.
So, in fact, when we're talking about this war, then you could say Putin tried to give a signal to Zelensky, this is very serious, and to the West. So let's come to an agreement in which Ukraine remains neutral, doesn't become a threat to, and the position of Crimea is recognized.
And what he was looking for was something on the Austrian model. Because just as once Austria became neutral and the Russian forces left, there was still a Russian representative on the Austrian Defense Council for many years. And his job was to make sure the Austrians actually carried out, to the fullness of the law, what they'd agreed to. And that's what Putin wanted in Kiev. I want a Russian on the National Defense Council so that they can monitor that you're genuinely neutral.
Yeah, but the interesting thing, of course, is how it's going to develop itself, because it became something different.
Well, that's right. The great lesson of margin of victory is that whatever you anticipated doesn't turn out to be the case.
Yeah.
So if you think you're moving in for a brief period of time, or this is going to be a short war, you've probably made a serious mistake. So before you start anything, you need to stand back and look at all the possibilities.
Do you think at the time that Putin was aware that in fact he was fighting a war against the West?
No.
No?
No, that's the problem. He thought we were approachable. He thought the people, especially in Berlin, he was shocked when Scholz shows up and spews this nonsense. It was a case of a cognitive dissonance, as we say in English. He couldn't reconcile what the man was saying with reality. He said, Scholz has joined this. Berlin is now in this camp that is violently anti-Russian. And we have no reason for the Germans to hate us. We've gotten along with the Germans. It's just sort of, what is going on? He couldn't believe it. He was surprised.
In fact, I wasn't surprised that his reaction was so fierce in the West. Maybe that it's
well, you live in the West.
I live in the West, of course, but especially in the Netherlands, we had this, of course, the issue with the MH17 at the time. You know, So there's a and I always think that we dealt in the wrong way with that, but that's another question. That's a very sensitive issue in the Netherlands. But I felt the you can say not the discontent, but maybe maybe a light form of hate towards Putin himself. They demonized him, and that started in 2014. I think this was the decisive moment in the Dutch relation to.
I think the problem there has always been his association with the KGB. The assumption is that he's another NKVD thug, like Yagoda in Ukraine, and that was absolutely not the case. The other thing is, and I had time when I was in graduate school to meet with defectors, many of whom were KGB agents or GRU people. And what you found from them was that they had traveled extensively outside of the Soviet Union. Yeah. They knew more about the West and had a very different view.
So they broadened their mind.
And that was the case with Putin. He had lived outside the country. He'd gotten to know Germany very well, liked the Germans, got along with the Germans. Yeah. And he began to see the West as a potential partner. Remember, he raised the issue of, could Russia join NATO?
Yeah, was this a serious proposal?
I think it was very serious on his part. I think he was looking for an opportunity to integrate Russia into the West. But he's always had people around him saying, Vladimir, you don't understand. Yeah. They hate us. It doesn't matter what you do. And it's always interesting to me that people are so anxious to attack Putin when he is probably the best possible representative of Western interests in Moscow of anybody that exists. Yeah. Everyone else was completely unsurprised by what we did.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very important remark, because the whole question is, when you start a war, you want to know about the outcome. And now, at the time, we're dealing with Putin, and you can say, well, Putin at least is a man, in a way prudent. He is not very aggressive towards the West. So the question is, when, for example, when you want a regime change, who do you think will be the alternative?
It's absurd. They have no idea what they're talking about. But that's not new. We never understood Vietnam. Yeah. We intervened in a civil war. We murdered the only man. We assassinated the only man that could hold the country together. His name was Diem. We created catastrophe. In Afghanistan, after we'd gone in, the one man that everyone was willing to live with in Afghanistan was the king, because he ran what we would call a confederation, where these were regional interests and so forth. What did we do? We removed him and put in a CIA agent named Karzai. And of course, then the corruption became unstoppable. We go into Iraq, and what do? We don't understand what we are doing. America blunders in like an elephant and crushes everything under its feet and then says, aren't you happy I'm here? Aren't you grateful that I've come? I'm the big elephant that's going to deliver everything you want. Yeah. Well, I think what was happening for Putin is that he starts this thing and he suddenly realizes the elephant is the enemy, not the friend. And then by June, his generals sit down with him and they said, look, if you're serious about this, we're going to have to change everything. Yeah. We're going to have to be prepared to fight for years. This is a large war of decision. And that's when he realizes this is an existential threat to Russia. Yeah. This is not something we are prepared under any circumstances to lose. Now, he never thought that was possible anyway, because very prudently he said strategically, you want to fight me on my doorstep? You're pretty stupid. And he was right. But he grossly miscalculated initially. He thought he was dealing with a different set of leaders from what it was actually there. And then he decides to change everything. By the time you get to the fall, he appoints new leadership, and the Russian Air Force general who took over command effectively in the East builds this defensive thing and says, look, we can't hold everything because we don't have enough forces. You're going to have to withdraw over here from Kharkov. The Ukrainians said, oh, look,
the defense line he built in Ukraine.
But then what's his name? I'm talking about the Russians, what the Russians built once they had established themselves in eastern Ukraine and the Russian-speaking areas. Okay. Yeah. To the north, they were very close to Kharkov, but it was very lightly defended. They only had 2,000 men up there. And the Ukrainians were told by us, because we began providing them with satellite intelligence.
How's this line called?
Well, it's just south of Kharkov. And it was just a plain right up to the river on the border with Russia. And we said, go ahead and attack that. And the commander said to President Putin, let him have it. It doesn't matter right now. We need to consolidate our position. Then we need to become impregnable. And when we've consolidated our position, our defenses are impregnable, then we launch offensives and we move out of them. Effectively, a repetition of Kursk from the Russian standpoint. And the Ukrainians were then invited to do what? Attack. Yeah. And we were stupid enough to tell them to attack. And what the Russians have proven and demonstrated, something they understood since the 70s, was the criticality of linking all of the overhead, space-based and terrestrial surveillance, unmanned and manned, drones, satellites, everything, with all of the standoff attack systems, rocket artillery, conventional artillery, tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, everything. Let's get into that. And when that was linked, then we didn't seem to appreciate the lethality of that system. I call it in my book, Margin of Victory, and previously in my previous book in 2003, Transformation Under Fire, I call it the ISR strike complex. Mm-hmm. And I said we have to integrate ground forces, maneuver, and logistics within this larger ISR strike complex. We have to go all the way back to Ogarkov in the 19th.
Yeah, that's the ISR is intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance.
And he talked about the recon strike platform in space that will allow them to target and destroy anything on the planet. Of course, they didn't have the technology. And so this was conceptual, but he was right. And that's what you see emerge in eastern Ukraine.
Let's get back to this moment. It's a decisive moment in June when his generals say, well, this is something different, and then we have to change course. Is it then they're starting to build those defense lines, huge defense lines? Is it Sulovikin? Isn't
yes,
Sulovikin. Yeah, that was the Sulovikin line. Yes. Yeah, that's the name I was looking for.
And he did a brilliant job.
Yeah, he did a brilliant job. Making those lines in Ukraine. So they built for months on the defensive side. Right. Because they knew that this was going to be a long and a hard battle.
And then he brings up additional reserves. Remember, it was initially 300,000. Then you got another 100,000. Now we're looking at even more, hundreds of thousands.
Well, one of the things you mention in your book, there is of course, this is a culture that is always, you can say, forms the context of an army. And of course, economy is a part of this culture. And I think one of the astonishing things that happened in the last 2 years is the way in which you could say the economy of Russia was transformed, and especially the military capacity to build arms.
But there was also no drop in the Russian standard of living. In fact, the Russian standard of living has improved.
But how is it possible that you can make a shift in such a short time?
Well, first of all, we have to keep in mind that
what were these all the production plans of the 80s? What did they do?
The plans. I mean, there are lots of plans on the shelf that were never thrown away. One of the things that the Russians don't do is throw things away.
That's what I mean.
They keep everything.
The plans.
But it wasn't just plans. You had to have the factories there. The manufacturing base had to exist. It was there. It just hadn't been mobilized and utilized. And at the same time, the Russians were always very good, and I think the Germans were, but not as good as the Russians during the Second War, of taking lessons from the field back to the scientists and the engineers. And they would come up front and look at what was happening, and they would make the changes that were necessary to improve the system, weapons platform. The other thing is that organizationally, the force that came into Ukraine is different from the force you had today. They made prudent changes, and they changed their chain of command. We have the same structure in NATO that we had in 1944-45, with all these echelons of command and control. Slows down the decision-making process. It's very hard to maneuver and manipulate. One of the things I pointed out in the book was that Eisenhower, as Supreme Commander, had to fight with U.S. and British Air Force officers to get them to bomb certain things that were vital to the success of the Normandy invasion. Because their attitude was, it doesn't matter what you do, we're winning the war by flattening Germany.
This is one of the main points also in your book, also at the end, in the conclusion, in which you say, well, there has to be a unity of command.
And you see on the Russian side, and when I covered the battle, the destruction of Army Group Center in June and July of 1944, even though the real numbers that I found were interesting because they destroyed far fewer Germans than we thought, and the Germans managed to do far greater damage to the Soviets than was reported. And the funny thing was that I discovered that the Germans had sent over 100,000 men on leave because they knew exactly where the Russians were coming. Oh, this Maskarova, forget it. It didn't work. The German soldiers in the field and the commanders in the field knew exactly what was coming, and Hitler refused to change dispositions. So they said, well, what's the point of losing, hundreds of thousands? So they sent 100,000 on leave. So on the day of the attack, there are 110,000 German soldiers facing 1 million. That's it. So, but that's aside from the point. But what you have with Zhukov, for instance, who's the overall commander of these fronts, he is able to summon 5,000 Soviet aircraft in the space of 15 minutes and hurl them at a stratification of German troops, which was enormously effective, successful, and strong.
And you're saying that right now?
But look at Zhukov versus Eisenhower. Eisenhower has to argue with the Air Force. Zhukov gives an order, and it all happens.
Never realized that.
Now that's what you saw with Surovikin.
But are you saying that Russia is exactly operating under this one command?
Yes. Right now? Now they are.
So they have the different services are.
Oh yes, they are absolutely integrated, and they are responsive. There is one man at every level who commands everything.
Commands everything.
Yeah. In other words, it's your level, whatever it is. Yeah. It may be 15,000, 20,000, 80,000, whatever it turns out to be. He commands everything, all the air forces. And here's a good example.
But how is it possible that you know all the different disciplines? You have to train on that.
Well, I think it's a question in the Russian case. First of all, historically, unity of command is something the Russians have always practiced.
Okay.
If the man who's the supreme commander says do it, everybody does it. We have no history of that. That was true under the Tsars. Now, his generals were often not the best. Well, there were also Soviet generals that weren't very good. There were some generals that were initially out there with the forces that went into Ukraine, as well as colonels and others. They're gone. They were removed. And you talk about democracy. There was an incident involving infantry. These were paratroopers that had been placed under the command of a brigade commander.
When was that?
This would have been the fall of 2022.
Okay.
They attacked and they took terrible losses.
Yeah.
And the paratroopers came back and they sat down and wrote a letter. They gave it to newspaper journalists and they explained why they'd failed in this attack, because all of the measures that should have been taken were not. And the man who was in command was at fault. That was brought to Putin's attention. Putin went to the front, removed him. And that's been going on over there. Now, some Russians would complain and say they haven't removed enough. I've heard Russians say that. But the truth is, Putin has done those things. And you now have a force that has very few weak links. It's similar to the quality of the German force that invaded Russia. After Poland and the Low Countries, all the weak, mediocre officers were gone. They were removed. And the best people were in the right jobs. That's what Putin now has in his force in Ukraine. But to go back to this instantaneous link, I went in and received a presentation from some people that I cannot name, but they're here in the United States, and they showed me where there was a request to launch a cruise missile at a building, and this was in, let's just say, north central Ukraine, in a city, because the Ukrainians had placed crew-served weapons, that is, missiles and artillery into this building. They couldn't get at it from the ground. They couldn't strike it effectively. And so within 10 minutes, a cruise missile was launched from the Black Sea Fleet of effort, and also commonality of communications and understanding. People understand across these service lines. We don't have that. We do sometimes at the lowest level, because the people down there who are doing the fighting, they have to do that. It's this upper levels where you have the problem.
But let's get back to this principle you introduced in your books. The importance of intelligence, of surveillance and reconnaissance.
Because you have to have surveillance all the time.
Yeah, and of course now we're living in information age. In which technology is and especially, of course, the ICT, the information communication technology, has become very important in the organization of anything. So also in the organization of an army, we have those satellites up in the sky, and now we're using the technology with drones. I think one of the surprising events is that the drone has become a central, you can say, instrument or what is it, a medium almost, in which this war is fought. How do you look at it? And from this intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance perspective.
Let's look at it from the standpoint of a function and effect. For many, many years, there was an old phrase, give the unit artillery and you've made the unit independent. In other words, if you had an infantry or cavalry force in the old days and you provided them with artillery, they could now go out and operate on their own, because as long as they were supplied with artillery, they could prepare the battlefield, attack targets, and then envelop or flank or whatever. Today, you give them unmanned systems at the lowest level, you've made them independent, because that unmanned system can provide instantaneous information. Let's say you are an infantry squad, maybe you have some armor with you. You can now see kilometers in front of you. You have a picture of everything right away. Now, some of that will come from above, but most of it's your own. You can now act on your own information immediately, because it's not just surveillance. You have to be able to act on it. We have this thing we call intelligence. Well, intelligence is information that's being analyzed and refined, but that takes time. So the first comes surveillance. That gives you the information. But at different levels, people can act on that and make it intelligence before it reaches the top.
And you talked about the organization of the army itself. Now in Russia, that means that, for example, a colonel who is fighting a battle somewhere and he's having the information can decide just to, let's say, phone for air support or something like that.
Well, today it's a question of we've done everything we can at our level and we can't fix the problem. Therefore, it goes up to be fixed. Someone at the next level who is a targeteer, someone who targets, matches weapons against targets, says, good, we got a cruise missile ready to go. And it goes instantly. For us, before anything can happen, it all has to be approved at multiple levels.
But that's the way that this Russian colonel can deal with it.
Yes, absolutely. A lieutenant colonel can deal with it. Captains can deal with it. I watched video of a Russian tank commander from a Russian tank platoon, and he's directing an entire battle that involves rocket artillery, conventional artillery rounds, some infantry on his flanks against a Ukrainian element that is just being annihilated, decimated.
It's fascinating because it's a kind of a decentralization.
Yes. But you've got to prepare for that because you want to be decentralized. You don't see massive concentrations of Russian forces on a narrow front the way you did 80 years ago because that's a target.
Yeah.
You want to be dispersed. You want to concentrate your fire and then briefly exploit it by concentrating some of your force, but then go back to dispersion as a matter of protection. And then you have to build in your own integrated air defense.
Yeah.
We have no integrated air defenses in NATO. Right now, we can protect 5% of NATO territory from air and missile attack. Think about that.
Yeah.
And people talk about going to war with Russia.
But
they're idiots.
What does that mean, having an integrated air defense?
That means that you have different kinds of air defense weapons at every level. You'll have the shoulder fired.
You bring it along with you.
And it all moves with you. And you'll see as the Russians move, they will halt at a certain range because they don't want to get out from under the integrated air defense umbrella. Because if they get out from under that, if they outpace it, then they can be detected and struck and killed.
But that's the way they have, of course they have this tradition, but they have reshaped their army the last 2 years.
Yes, dramatically.
And they learned at a very high pace.
For instance, they've gotten to fight with brigades. But in contrast to us, we'll have a brigade of, say, 5,000, maybe less, maybe more, and we'll fight that unit. What the Russians do is that they have the brigade headquarters, and they always have 5 battalions at their disposal, on average, 4 or 5, but they rotate them. Okay, it's been 48 hours. This battalion goes back for rest. Another battalion comes in and takes its place. So they are very sensitive to the impact of close combat on their own troops. They never
mentally and physically.
They never cared in the past.
No.
They care very much.
But it's still the story we're telling, that the Russians are having their troops as cannon fodder and
if anything, I'm amazed because I know history very well.
Yeah.
And even great commanders.
Because fighting the Germans, they were just
They took at least twice the losses that they admit publicly. When I was in Moscow in November 2001, and I was there, I was still on active duty then, and I was there as a delegation, and we went to the Russian General Staff College, and we met with the Russian General Staff. And they told me, I asked point blank, I said, what about the losses during the Second World War? We all know that, the official losses are inaccurate. They said, oh, that's true. And so I asked, what is the right answer? And they said 2 things. They said, in the NKVD archives, this is the Secret Police archives, we've been counting the losses. We're up to 39,900,000. Now remember that Stalin executed 1 million soldiers in the Soviet army for refusing to fight the Germans. Very few people know that. The Germans executed 23,000 soldiers in the whole war for failing to obey orders under fire. Think about the difference in the two. Stalin's army was a slave army. People were driven like slaves into gunfire. At the same time, they said, take whatever figures are there, the official Soviet figures, and multiply them by a factor of 2 or at least 1.5. And then you'll have a better picture of the losses of just soldiers, which they estimated to be 15, 16 million.
Of course, the story still up to this day is that the way Russians fight is that they don't care about their soldiers.
Yeah, but what happened was that MI6, the CIA, working with the Ukrainians, dusted off all of this nonsense, all this business from the Second World War, and repurposed it and sent it out, saying, well, this is the same thing as you've seen in the past. It's not. It's absolute rubbish.
Is there trustworthy information about the sum of casualties that have fallen on both sides?
Well, in the West, no. Not from official sources.
But from your sources, what?
My sources are a combination of things. I've had to depend heavily on friends in Europe that I've known for years, and some of those are actually on the other side, as well as in Ukraine.
Yeah.
For instance, there's one, I shouldn't even say it, but I will, one Pole who has grandparents who are Ukrainian and relatives that are in a position to talk. And they give a very different picture of what's happening. I mean, today, the picture that is emerging is that all the Ukrainian people just desperately want an end to this. Yeah. You now have Ukrainians are saying, for God's sakes, let the Russians come and put an end to this, insanity. You have Ukrainian soldiers being interviewed that you can watch on Telegram saying,
yes, I know. Yeah.
We should go with them and kill this Zelensky and this crew.
But how many casualties are we?
On the Ukrainian side, I'm reliably told that it's now probably 600,000 Ukrainian dead soldiers, over 1 million casualties. And remember that they haven't had the effective medical evacuation and treatment that exists on the Russian side. Okay. The Russians have had probably 50,000 dead, although some claim less, some claim more. I would certainly say 50,000. You might come up with numbers for 55 to 60,000, particularly if you look at the Donetsk and Luhansk militias and perhaps Kadyrov's Chechen forces. It might go to 60, 63,000. But, the difference is profound.
Yeah. Now the story goes, of course, that the one who is attacking has more casualties, much more casualties.
And the Russians have let them attack.
That's one of the story. Yeah.
But we're the ones, we in the West, that have been urging them to go forward. If you go and look at some of these television generals on the U.S. side, as I call them, people like Petraeus and Keane and others, and they say, I think the Ukrainians are really super prepared for this. They're well-trained. They have just the right equipment. I know they're going to break through these defenses. And then they try to talk about how to break through the defenses. They don't know what they're talking about. Because the Russians have built defenses in depth that are linked to all the surveillance. The Ukrainian
they didn't even reach the Slovakian lines.
And the Ukrainians say, as soon as I stick my head out of the foxhole, I'm under attack. There's a drone up there. So it's a layered operation terrestrially as well as in space. In other words, you've got it at every level. And again, it's not enough to see it. You have to be able to attack. And the Russians have mastered the links.
But at the same time, we must admit that Ukrainians have been fighting very bravely. I mean, it is so.
Putin has said that.
Yeah.
There's no question about it. You can go back and read about the Ukrainian
because the war is going on for 2 years now, and the Ukrainian army isn't defeated up to now.
Well, it's
disintegrating. It's disintegrating?
Because I think...
Are the Russians simply waiting at the time and just...
The Russians don't really want to cross the river and go west. And one of the reasons for that is that Putin says, if I cross the river right now, which he could easily do that, they'll say, see, he wants to conquer Eastern Europe. And he says, we've never been interested in that. We have no interest in that. That's not what we want.
Yeah. No, but there's a big chance he's going for Odessa, isn't it?
Odessa is historically a Russian city, a Russian-speaking city. It was never Ukraine.
But there's still a huge distance from the Donbass to the Dnieper. I mean...
Well, there are a lot of bridges, and the Russians have deliberately left them intact. And what I see happening right now is this forces up near Kharkov are acting like a magnet for the Ukrainians.
Yes.
They're pulling forces from other places and putting them there because
there's weakening them in the south.
And they said the Russians are going for Kiev, which they may yet do before this is over. But right now, that's not the goal. The goal is to get the Ukrainian forces up there for two reasons. Number one, you're weakening the south, which makes it much easier to cross down there and seize Odessa. And secondly, you're killing what's left that can fight. Vast numbers of units have simply refused to attack. And I don't blame them. Why would you do it? I mean, the French army rebelled in 1917. They were tired of dying.
So what kind of war the Ukrainians are in right now? Because it's...
Well, they're fighting a NATO war.
Because you might as well say that this war is not an existential war in the sense that they're fighting for their own, but that they're with fighting, they're in fact undermining their own existence.
Exactly. In other words, they're committing suicide.
Yeah, that's exactly. It's a suicidal war.
Yeah, and Zorovikin invited them to do it, and that's where they've taken most of their losses against his defense, just as the Germans were stupid and took the bait at Kursk. There were big debates. The Russian deputy chief of staff of the Russian general staff, and I cover this in the book.
Mm-hmm.
He was a tremendous Russian patriot. His father had been a colonel in the Tsar's army. And he planned Kursk in great detail. He set up defenses. And he went in to see Stalin, and he had on one side Zhukov, and I think on the other Sokolovsky, or I can't remember. The book covers this. And I found it fascinating because Stalin, of course, was just like Hitler. Attack, attack, attack. And the deputy chief of staff said something to Stalin that no one ever said. No, sir. He said, what? We can't win this war without attacking. He said, no, sir. We will lose the war if we attack, because at that point in 1943, what could the Germans do brilliantly? Maneuver. Yeah. That's something the Russians still hadn't learned yet. He said, no. He said, this is my plan. And he described it and said, the Germans can't resist attacking this. Let them expend themselves on this impregnable Kursk salient. And once they've expended themselves, then we can go on the offensive. And Stalin got up and walked around and wasn't happy. And the two generals, marshals, were shaking. They were so concerned, so I'm told. And he came back and said, all right, but you know what this means. And everybody did. If this fails, you'll be shot. It worked. Yeah. And Zorovikin is not dealing with Stalin. Zorovikin made it work. Now, he was then shipped out for other kinds of reasons because of turmoil. Remember, this man who died in a plane crash, I can't remember his name, Prigozhin. Oh, yeah, Prigozhin. Yeah, when Prigozhin talked about what he thought was wrong in the high command of the Russian military, he was not wrong. He was very critical of a lot of things. But it was not the sort of thing one should do publicly. And certainly you don't lead some sort of crusade back to Moscow to see the Tsar. That's outrageous, which is effectively what he did. But Putin acted and did remove people and change things. And you had just very recently, you had more people removed. You had 3 general officers in various positions and one on the deputy chief of the general staff for logistics, all on corruption charges. You know, a lot of people don't understand how much time both Putin and Xi spend on corruption. It's a problem. So they've cleaned a lot up, and the Russian army now is probably better than it's been, certainly in 50, 60 years. Maybe better than it ever was. We don't know. But the point is that it's an existential war for Russia. They understand that now. The West is out to destroy them. They listened to Biden say that in March in Poland, that Putin is evil. We have to have regime change. And when Biden was asked, his handlers, I guess, had given him this answer. He says there can be no agreement on the current lines. There is no compromise with evil. You know, is this foolish ideology? Everyone who disagrees with us is evil and must die. This is sort of stupidity in Washington, D.C.
So you're talking about the disintegration of the Ukraine army right now.
But again, remember, Putin has never wanted to cross that river. But there's a large force up in Belorussia that can come down in the north, straight into Kiev, and he can cross that river and go north to Kiev. And who is going to interfere with him? There's nothing over there to do so.
How do you think that this is going to develop itself? I don't know. Do you think Putin still has a master plan now, or is it just acting on the situation?
Well, everybody has to act on the situation, but he does have a master plan. And I think what they'd hoped for in the past and what they wanted was a new government to emerge in Kiev that says, that's enough. We want peace. I think there was a hope that one of the Ukrainian generals...
But also this idea of denazification.
Yeah, well, that's easily done if we want to do it. And you purge all those symbols and you get rid of those people. Those people have to go somewhere else. They can't stay. But there aren't that many. I mean, it's one of these, it's disproportionate. In fact, there was one of these so-called Nazi Ukrainian units got into a fight with a Polish unit because they wanted the Polish troops that were there to attack right into the teeth of the Russian enemy. And the Polish commander told them, "You're out of your mind. We're not going to do it." And so then they threatened them, and the Poles killed them. These things don't reach the United States. We don't know what the hell is really going on down there.
Yeah.
The Ukrainians have had it. It's over. It's done. The Russians have won. We're the ones who lack complete compassion and human understanding. We're driving this nation of people to disaster. Millions have left. Millions will never come back. I don't know what happens to rump Ukraine, but I can guarantee you that it will be neutral, whatever it is. And frankly, Putin doesn't care who runs it as long as it's devoid of NATO forces. Now you've had Scholz finally step forward, contradict Macron, and say there will be no NATO soldiers on the ground in Ukraine. Yeah. It's over. We're not going to do that. Out of the question.
Yeah, and of course, Marine Le Pen had a huge victory now with the last election. So the climate is changing in Europe. So, Doug, now we're going to talk about the West and our future and the war that is raging in the West, because we're fighting a proxy war, in fact. You talked about the way Russia and Putin looked at the West, and in fact they were surprised by the way we acted, surprised by the grand scheme of things, you can say. But they adopted themselves, and they started to fight a new war, a different war that has become more and more of an existential war. And you corrected me in the beginning that Putin didn't have the intention to confront the West, but now he is, you can say, taking up this battle. And of course, we try to eliminate the Russian economy. We threw them out of SWIFT system, and together with China and India, they strengthened the BRICS relationship. They were even working on their own financial system, exactly. So what becomes clear now is that the division between East and West is once again profound. Not only Russia but also China and India, somewhat in the middle, but still part of the BRICS. So now the future of the West is at stake, and we have been fighting wars, and especially the United States, since the Second World War, and not very successful, as you described. And it made me think of this very also beautiful period, but also disruptive period in the history of Athens, in which Athens was able to have this confrontation with Persia, and to win the Second Persian War by adopting new strategies. There was a famous general at the time, Themistocles, who really changed the whole structure of, you can say, the army. And they started to fight with with a fleet instead of the phalanx. So there's obviously the Greek people, or the people of Athens, were willing to change this strategy. But at the same time, you can say that this victory over Persia was the beginning of the end of the Greek, of the Athens. It became an imperial power, and within this, you can say, this period of about 60, 70 years, there's also the period in which the famous philosopher Socrates was born, Plato later on, and they all sensed the downfall of Athens in a way, and somehow. It made me think of what the West, and the period the West is in right now. Like we have the Athenian the fleet, and it was a sea, like a kind of navy. They had other city-states in it, but it became very dominant. But in fact, they had under the leadership of Pericles, they were moving towards this big confrontation with Sparta. And the war broke out in 431, I think, before Christ, and it was the beginning of the end of and this Peloponnesian War was a kind of a suicidal war, in fact, and now it made me think of what is going on right now. Like we won the United States won the Second World War. We always forget Russia. I think without Russia, there would have been a different outcome of the Second World. But never mind. The Second World, and of course, then came the big victory in the 80s and the 90s. At least that's the way we experienced it in the West. Like the spirit of triumphalism. I don't know whether it's an English word. Yeah, it's a good word. Triumphalism. Instead of reflecting on what happened and that the USSR dismantled itself, in the West there was this spirit of triumph at the time, and I think you described the battle in the beginning of the 90s in your book, Margin of Victory, and we can say. In the beginning of the 90s, we not only the military but the culture as a whole, we set a course in a certain direction. But I think maybe that was the beginning of the end of the Western Order as well.
Well, Paul Kennedy, in his book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, talks about a lot of these issues, that what brings down great powers. Most of it is internal and suicidal as opposed to any great failure in war. And the United States, in particular, in the aftermath of 1991's Desert Storm, was intoxicated with its sense of absolute supremacy. Now, when I say the United States, I'm talking about people in Washington. The average American was just happy that we were successful. A lot of people took the position we've now erased the stain on our honor from Vietnam. You know, we put this behind us. We're back on a good track now. And unfortunately, everybody talked about what they said was a benefit of downsizing the military, that we would have this big capital gain that would allow us to devote ourselves to other things and so forth. Well, it really didn't happen. We came to certain wrong conclusions. We faced an adversary who was formidable on paper, but really wasn't as capable as a Russian or a Turkish or a Japanese or Chinese enemy. We became full of ourselves, and we decided that whatever we'd done was right. And instead of looking at this as an opportunity to make profound change in new directions, we kept everything as it was. We just downsized the militaries so they became antiquated versions of what we think won the war, which was, after all, another manifestation of a World War II style force structure. So militarily, it was stagnation after that. We spent a lot of money because we were enamored of push-button success. We began to think of wars, once again, not reflecting on the flesh and blood, the human dimension, but we began thinking in terms of, well, how much money do we need to buy the new missile? The new missile is our new wonder weapon, you know, delivered by the Air Force or the Navy or something else. And there's nobody else out there, much like at the...
Can you say that we were bewitched by technology at the time? Because the way you describe the battle, also the battle you took part in, is a kind of superiority at the time, from a military standpoint, in which the casualties on the Western side were minimal, and on the side of the enemy, they were huge. So, and it seemed that we had such a, especially the United States, such a technological superiority that in fact wars could be won by technology.
Yeah, and there were very few of us that actually saw action against an enemy that fought back. In many cases, the enemy just gave up and walked. This led to certain false assumptions. First of all, They forgot the human dimension to combat. They didn't understand what had happened and whom they'd fought. This probably had more in common with the wars that the British and the French fought in their colonies before World War I. And, of course, they were very pleased with themselves. And they were so pleased with themselves that they began to fantasize that they could take on the Germans. And, of course, the Imperial German Army was very different from the Sudanese tribesmen, the Zulus, or the Pashtun tribesmen up in northwest India, or the Berbers and the Rifs, and so forth. Big mistake. And we know how that turned out. Millions of people died. It was a disaster. And once again, we intervened. And as a result, the French and the British came out of it with their empires, which is all they cared about in the final analysis, but it didn't achieve much. 1991 was another great achievement, but instead of saying, look, that's good, that's fine, we don't need to meddle in the rest of the world. We just need to do business with the rest of the world, which is the traditional American viewpoint.
Yeah.
After World War I and even after World War II, we dramatically downsized our militaries, and we were trying to pursue good relations with everybody. We discovered that we'd actually not won the Second World War that Stalin had, and now we had a tremendous adversary or opponent in communism. Well, after 1991, there was no such thing. There was nobody out there. And that led us to the false assumption that we could do anything, anywhere, anytime that we wanted to. And you have this famous memorandum penned in the Pentagon by Paul Wolfowitz, who at the time was, I guess, the Undersecretary for Policy and Strategy, something like that. And it simply said this: we're the boss. There's nobody.
It was the famous unipolar moment.
Yeah. And we can use our military as we see fit, and we can rectify everything. And of course, he was focused
like Athens in the Mediterranean at the time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We forgot, though, we're preeminently what? A maritime power. We're not a continental power. There's a big difference. Continental powers have historically been very good at fighting long, hard wars. Maritime powers don't do that very well because we're primarily naval. And today it's naval and air. And we've got a very small army at this point. We can't even recruit for it. We're having trouble recruiting for all the armed forces. But what people have to understand is that we are a version of the British Empire. But we probably should have taken the opportunity to change our relationship with the rest of the world, to demilitarize it, which is what I talk about doing now. But we didn't want to do that because the military was our trump card, we thought. Madeleine Albright, who told General Powell, you keep talking about this great army. Well, we want to use it. We want to go to Somalia. We want to go to Haiti. We want to go to Bosnia. I was in the War Plans Division of the Army Staff in 1994, and I was asked to write a memorandum. I had a wonderful boss, very competent man, full colonel, should have been a general. His name was Foster, Bill Foster, very smart. He said, look, McGregor, just put this together. We need a 2-pager. And I said, well, what do you want me to say? He said, well, I want you to say what you think, but I think you think what I think. And I said, well, what's that? He said, what the hell are we doing in the Balkans? America has no interest in that place, and we don't want to be embroiled in this Balkan Civil War. If the Europeans want to go in there, we can support them, but we shouldn't have anything to do with this.
It's interesting because at the time, my first doubts about the NATO began to rise. And I was always in favor of NATO and the United States as a child, or the way I was raised. We went to Normandy, and my father was also very positive about America, and that's the spirit I was raised in. Yeah, and during the 90s, I think, especially the Kosovo crisis, and I started to have my doubts. I said, what exactly is going on? And in fact, when we're talking about the war in Ukraine, it's all related to this period, to this shift in time, the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, and the course we took as Western culture as a whole. So of course we have the issue of the military and the way the military is organized on the one hand, and on the other hand, and that's a very fundamental issue you addressed. The way we relate to other countries and to other cultures.
And by the way, in that memorandum, there was something else I put in there, which he strongly agreed with and was very well received when it went up to the Army Chief of Staff, who took it to the White House after they'd had a meeting in the tank That's what we call where the Joint Chiefs meet. And it said the Balkans historically is an area of Russian interest, not American interest. Moving into the area will not be well received in Moscow. And we wanted at the time, well, now you're talking about the military. We wanted good relations with the Russians. We weren't interested in confrontation. On the contrary, we saw them as partners. So what are we doing there was the question. And the Chief of Staff agreed, went over there, but of course it went nowhere. And a year later, I was in Sarajevo representing the J6. Was it the J6, J7, J5, J5, who at the time was Wes Clark. He was a 3-star, and I went there to represent his. Then I came back to Dayton, and we embroiled ourselves in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And then just a year later, and this is I guess it was a couple of years later, this would have been November 97, I'm at Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe under General Clark, and we're still dealing with Bosnia, but now we're beginning to see trouble in Kosovo.
Yeah.
And the rest of the story. And again, these old issues came up again. The Germans in particular, the military, were very uncomfortable with this whole business in Kosovo. And they kept saying, we don't really want to go there. We don't have a good history down in Yugoslavia. We don't want to intervene there. And I said, well, I agree with you. The French were sort of, they went along with the idea. Yeah. Other Europeans, the further away you got from the Balkans, the more enthusiastic people were. So the Italians and the Greeks said, have you lost your minds? What are you doing? The Italian defense minister made a comment. He said, you realize that if we go into Kosovo, we become the new Serbs. And then tried to explain what was going on there and the Albanians and the criminality. And it was hopeless. But this was a steady march into more and more interventions. And remember, we'd failed badly in Somalia. Yeah. We went there to rescue people from starvation, and we got into a war because we didn't like the tribal chiefs, and we were told we're going to nation build in Somalia. So this is a long history, and the anti-Russian sentiment really, really takes off in a major way in Kosovo because the Russians made it very clear they didn't like this, they didn't want it, and they were offended. And you see, remember this caravan of Russian BTR-60s that came up all the way from Bosnia into Kosovo, flying the Russian flag, and the Serbs were cheering them because the Russians were so weak at that point and so incapable. There's nothing they could do to stop us from what we'd done to the Serbs. And the Germans were horrified because they said, why are we bombing these people? Yeah. And what was heard most readily or most often inside NATO circles from those of us in uniform was, we thought NATO existed to prevent wars from breaking out in Europe. Why is NATO starting a war?
Yeah, that's exactly the turnaround in Athens as well. What started as a defense force became an offensive force.
But here's something else that you're talking about in connection with Athens and Sparta, that initially Sparta felt very strong and powerful, but it too forgot that it was a maritime empire, not a continental, not a land power like Sparta.
Athens,
took on Sparta. Now, the Spartans didn't have to fight, but they felt honor-bound to fight. They felt if they didn't attack, they would be attacked. We can just go down the list of why do countries fight. And this is explained by, what's his name?
Heraclitus.
No, the author of the Peloponnesian Wars. The name escapes me. Anyway, the point is they give these reasons. Well, they go to war for honor. They go to war because they're under threat. They go to war.
You mean the Greek author Thucydides?
Yes.
Thucydides.
He explains this very well.
Yeah, definitely.
But now, for me, as an American, I saw shadows of the British Empire. Because the British end up going to war in 1914 when they don't have to, against a people that was never their enemy, with whom they'd always had good relations, on behalf of a country that had been their enemy for hundreds of years.
Since the Middle Ages.
Insane. Yeah. Makes no sense. And then with Russia, that the British, starting from the Congress of Vienna onward, treat as this evil, barbarous entity that has to be contained, all for the purpose of destroying Germany. It didn't make any sense. It's World War I that begins the destruction of Britain and the British Empire. It is World War II that finishes Britain completely. And my fear right now, looking at the world, is precisely that we end up in a conflict with the Russians, with whom we have no reason to fight under any circumstances, or for that matter, the Chinese, but certainly the Russians, and for reasons that we can discuss, a war with Russia is inevitably going to involve China. It may even involve India. We don't seem to understand the world has changed. This is not the world of the early 20th century or the late 19th century. These are not great power struggles. I mean, I love John Mearsheimer, but John's stuck in this paradigm of before World War. We live in an entirely new world. None of this makes any sense anymore. No one in their right mind should be interested in the West going to war with anybody. There's no reason to. And the problem is that I'm worried that we're on the verge of doing what the British did and destroying ourselves in the process. Now, there is a difference. And this is true for you and it's true for us. If we look at Russia, Russia's societal cohesion is stronger today than perhaps it's been since World War I. I mean, people, everybody in Russia is behind this war. Of course, there are exceptions.
Yeah, so sometimes one of the side effects of a war is the unity.
If the war is successful, if it goes the right way, if it's for the right reasons, if it's just. We involved ourselves in Vietnam, and the opposite happened to us because it was unjust. It was strategically irrelevant. It was wrong. We killed 2 million people for nothing. Now we've killed, 800,000 people in the Middle East at least for nothing. So America's in a very different position right now. And our society is not strong. We have at least 52 million people inside our country who were not born inside our country. That's probably not the complete number because we have all these other migrants and illegals that have come in. Somebody said we have 40 million plus illegals inside the United States. The point is our societal cohesion is terrible. We have people that living in this country, they're not interested in being Americans. They didn't come to become Americans. Most of these people came here either to benefit from it in some way or simply the ticket of admission to go make money.
Yeah, I think the same holds for Europe at this moment. And the kingdom divided in itself, this is one of the famous phrases of the Hobbes political theory, becomes weak. Now, let's return to these 90s, because was it simply naivete of the Americans, or has there been fought a battle within the administration as well?
I don't think there was any battle because I don't think there was much resistance. I can tell you that Bill Clinton privately, to his credit, didn't want to become involved anywhere in the Balkans. Okay. But everybody around him did. You had Madeleine Albright, Sandy Berger, who was the National Security Advisor. You had people in the State Department.
But so that means there was also an ideology behind.
Yes, and this is part of this ideology of...
a very successful ideology within the administration or the governance.
Yeah, expanding American power and influence at the point of abandon.
Okay, we all know, of course, of the neocons and the project for the new American century. It's not hidden. They have this program. The idea of America as the hegemonial power.
And most Americans, I think, weren't paying any attention. This is our biggest problem. I once had a Spanish general staff officer work closely with me at SHAPE headquarters. He was wonderful. Mm-hmm. And he used to say, Douglas, America is not a country. It's a planet. And he wasn't wrong. Most Americans, and if you travel across this country, I'm not talking about the big urban centers like New York, LA, Philadelphia, because those are so radically different now. Yeah. It's hard to even count them. But you go out beyond them in the country, in the rest of the country, most Americans just want to live. Mm. They're not interested in any of this. They don't know where most of it is. Our education has failed us badly over the last several decades. Most Americans don't understand the world. They have no sense of geography. Somebody steps up and says, we're the best, we're the greatest. And everybody says, yeah, all right, we're the best, we're the greatest. What else? And, well, we have to prove it to these damn Chinese. We can't let them invade Taiwan. Nobody's invading Taiwan. The Chinese are interested in invading Taiwan. But we talk about these things. We say, yeah, we can't let that happen. Oh, why? Oh, well, the Taiwanese are Democrat. Oh, okay. The average American plays along. And it's dangerous, just as the average Brit before World War I was in the same position.
Say it's not much of a battle at the time. You can say this is the process of globalization was rapidly speeding up since the 90s.
You had the sinister agenda to bring large numbers of people who are not originally European into a country that historically is originally European. We all speak English, but the core American population came from Europe. Now, there's a portion of the core population that is American. They came from Africa. And everybody spends a lot of time talking about slavery and so forth, although we ended that, for all intents and purposes, quite early. We stopped bringing in any more slaves, and then we fought a war to end this thing completely. But my point is that they, too, are Americans, like this European core. So if you want to rule America, what do you have to do? You have to destroy the core. And that's been underway now for many, many years. And you do that through immigration. The Democrats had an old expression that went back to the 50s and 60s. If I can't get enough people to vote for me here, I'll get them from overseas.
Of course, immigration has become a very important topic also in Europe. In fact, in the Netherlands, I think it was the main topic during our elections. We have seen the European elections in which it was played a very big role. I also already mentioned Marine Le Pen in France. Also in the United States has become a very serious political.
But what people have to understand is a dual track.
Mm-hmm.
While you're intervening and meddling all over the world to impose your will. And remember, we talk about democracy, but we're bullies. We go in and tell you, these are the crops you're going to grow. Yeah. These are the things you're going to produce. If you don't do it our way, we'll sanction you. We have 35, 36 countries under sanctions. Sanctions are really an act of war. It's insane. You know, so much for our belief in free trade and commerce and everything else. It's nonsense. We have been trying to structure the world financially, economically, in a way that serves us. We see ourselves as the center of the world. Now, when I say we, I'm not talking about the American people.
No, exactly. But Andy, I saw in your book you mentioned once Oswald Spengler. I think he's underestimated, great thinker, in fact. But
he's spinning in his grave.
But he's making clear that in the period of civilization, economy, technology becomes the dominant actors in a society. In fact, we're witnessing the dynamics right now. But what he also is trying to say that economy is a war with different means.
Yes.
We were talking about the 90s. You can say, and America became this hegemonial power, the unipolar moment. You were talking about not the average American, but let's say the elites,
the ruling elite,
the ruling elite. So and we're talking about politics, and we're talking about economy. I think that's and technology.
Right.
So like the decisive powers within a civilization at this time.
And that's the essence of globalism, which you've just described.
Exactly. That's the essence of globalism. So,
but remember what globalism was. It was an obedient, sedated consumer population.
Yes, exactly.
So how do you get that? Well, you have to change the character, the composition, the culture of the core populations.
Yes.
You can't really change them, so you flood them with people who are radically different from them.
Yeah, and you dismantle the different kinds of communities, the local communities. Hannah Arendt calls it the atomization. The atomization of society is also a preparation for a new totalitarian structure.
But remember, it was very seductive in the 90s. It was seductive under Reagan. Reagan is the president that announced amnesty for millions from Mexico. And everybody said, don't do this. Millions more will come. He said, oh, no, this is a one-time thing.
Yeah.
Well, this played into the hands of the so-called globalists. They want to be able to rule without interruption.
But this is your vision on what goes on right now.
Well, what's happening now, though, and I think it's happening in Europe, at least the recent EU elections would suggest it, and I think it's very strong here in the United States, is there's a backlash. The proverbial frog now realizes the water is boiling, and has decided he wants to jump out. We always talk about the boiling frog, and what happened all through the 80s and the 90s was that the heat was gradually turned up internally on the frog, and the frog swam, comfortably. Now, what does that mean? It means that if you said to somebody, I'm really uncomfortable with what's happening with immigration, have you looked at the people that are being invited to come into the United States? Do you understand what chain migration means? We're getting people from all over the world, none of whom have anything in common with us, culture. Oh, you're a racist. No, I don't want to be a racist. Well, you're a racist if you object.
But they always said, of course,
that's gone. That's going away.
The interesting thing is, when I was young in the 70s, they gave this example of the melting pot in the United States, and they said, well, the melting pot worked in the 19th century, but we see a shift already in the beginning of the 20th century. As soon as people from Southern Europe came in, that's what we learned at the time, and in the 70s at school.
And in 1924, we stopped immigration. That's what a lot of people don't understand. And we stopped it because we said, we're not getting the people we want.
Yes.
And who were the people we wanted? We wanted people who were like the people that already lived here.
But
and so what happened? There was literally an office set up by President Woodrow Wilson that was the Office of Nordic Immigration. Think about that. Oh, well, Wilson was a Nazi. Well, there weren't any Nazis at that point. This is silly. We looked who settled the United States, who built it. Now, if you go back and look at the Southern Europeans and others that came, East Europeans that came in, between 1815 and 1924, how many people emigrated to the United States from Europe? 32 million. That's a tiny number. And we stopped it in 1924 because the final waves that were coming in, we found large numbers of people from Eastern Europe coming in who were communists, stirring up labor unrest. This frightened people. We had people coming in from Sicily and Calabria, not northern Italy, from southern Italy, and they were bringing with them what? The Cosa Nostra, criminality and mob. We were alarmed. Now, of those 32 million, almost 2 million ultimately went back because they could not assimilate into the country. That's how strong the American population was. When we went to war with Mexico in 1846, we fought that whole war with volunteers. Everyone said we must win this war because we must control the North American continent. We're going to drive them out and defeat them. But after the war was over, did we occupy Mexico? No. And within the entire area that we took over, there were only about 120,000 people. California, New Mexico, Arizona, we filled those places with millions of Europeans rapidly and built it up. There was nothing there. Why? We knew who we were. If you said, are you an American? You get an answer, yes. And who was an American? Andrew Jackson was an American. U.S. Grant was an American. Robert E. Lee was an American. All these people were Americans. They knew who and what they were. They understood the law. They understood the Constitution. They understood their history and how they got where they are. Today, you gather a group of Americans in a room and say, who here is an American? And you may not even get everybody to put their hands up. And people are questioning, what does it mean to be an American? Good is it?
Makes me think of this famous American author. He published a book in the 90s. It was the how was it called? Let me think. Samuel Huntington.
Yes, he wrote a wonderful book. Who Are We?
Exactly. That was the clash of civilization. Well, but later on, he wrote this book. Who Are We?
And this book is still valid. Who Are We? And he makes a lot of sense in there. And we've ignored it. We've ignored it because anybody who raised objections and said, "No, wait a minute, who are these people taking down our monuments?" I'm by all the definitions, I'm a Yankee. My ancestors lived in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. And when the Civil War came, they were either Quakers or they fought. Some of them were in the Union Army. Now, we don't hate Southerners, but, leaving the Union was unacceptable. Human slavery was unacceptable. We went to war. After it was over, we all became Americans. And all of these monuments that everyone's upset about were built as a means of reconciliation between the people of the South and the people of the North to bring them back in again. And today, who's first to step forward and fight for the United States anywhere in the world at any time? People from the South.
So then let's get back to America. We talked about the 90s, this idea of globalization, like a kind of ideology that determined, I think, the next decades of the Western world.
And what is this ideology about?
And this ideology,
it's about denationalization.
Yeah, exactly.
We can't have any more Dutch people.
Yeah.
We don't want any more core Americans. We don't want any more Germans, any more Italians. What? What's wrong with it?
Yeah, and now
has it been that bad?
There's another interesting publication in the 90s. It was by the Spanish sociologist Castells. Maybe you know him. He wrote this. It's a very, very, I think, profound analysis of what the rise of network society would imply, because this very functional, financial, you can say, way to look at reality had a backlash. And in his first book is The Rise of the Network Society. The second part of his trilogy is the power of identity. So he thinks, well, the identity becomes more and more important exactly in this period of globalization. I think he's absolutely right on that. So that's what we're witnessing right now in the United States, in Europe, and nationalism is one of the you can say phenomena that has something to do, and also the fierce manifestation of nationalism, also you can say the barbaric manifestation of nationalism is related to this process of globalization in which functional financial networks has become predominant in the way reality is organized.
And that's when people fall back on the things that they know, the things that have not failed them, the things that they believe in. I watched this in Bosnia. What was it? Well, in the case of the Bosniaks, suddenly they became very Muslim. Most Bosniaks who were originally, Muslims under the Turks, by the time Yugoslavia had begun to fall apart, the average Bosniak had no interest in going to the mosque. What about the Croats who were Roman Catholics? What about the Serbs under communism? Not so much, but now suddenly in the midst of the Civil War, religion and culture were inextricably intertwined, and they became fiercely powerful instruments. There's a famous professor of political science, Ernst, and I'm trying to remember his name, anglicized as Ernest, and I can't remember his last name, terrible. But he wrote books on nationalism. He understood much of it very well, and he used to call nationalism, if it's healthy, the dog doesn't bark. Yeah. But nationalism, when it's unhealthy, is the dog that barks. The dog is barking all over Europe. It's barking here in the United States.
Exactly.
And it's barked in Russia. Yeah. And in Russia, it's healthy, strong, vibrant.
I don't know whether it's really healthy or not, but I can say in Ukraine it has some very dark.
Oh yeah, but that was planted by us. Yeah. That did not emerge spontaneously. No. We cultivated that.
No, in a way, it was
underneath.
Homegrown.
But it was underneath.
Yeah,
it was underneath, and it was resurfaced in a terrible way. Just as people say. What do you think about the Second World War? I think it was horrible. There's nothing good in it.
Do you think there is a chance that there will be a backlash in Ukraine in which they become very angry towards the West?
I hope so, because they should. They should become very angry with us, particularly with Washington, D.C., because they've died pointlessly in a war that never needed to be fought. Putin understands the history of his own country. he knows that one of the reasons he doesn't want to cross that river and go west is he doesn't want to govern those people. No. What a terrible thing to do.
Russia's big enough already.
The big joke in Moscow was, well, let's give it to the Poles, and everybody laughs. How well did the Poles do with the Ukrainians? Not very well. I think Putin would turn it over to whomever the hell wants it, but he just wants it to be neutral. You know, the rump, whatever it turns out to be, must be neutral. He wants that distance between Russia and the West. And frankly, if you look at the way we've treated Russia, what we're doing now, because the emphasis is let's just go kill Russians. Let's commit more destructive acts against Russia. Insane. The war's done. It's over. They've won. What are we doing? You know, it goes back to something we were talking about earlier. In the fall of 1943, General Arnold and General Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army, and Arnold was effectively Chief of Staff of the Air Force, so it wasn't separate then, came over at the request of Admiral Leahy, who was operating as the Chief of Staff for FDR, interpreting military affairs, and he said, please sit down. Then he looked at it and said, what are you doing? And they said, what do you mean? You're bombing the Japanese and the Germans into the Stone Age.
Yeah.
We want to live with these people when the war is done.
Yeah.
He said, we don't want this. And Marshall and Arnold were both shocked. They had no idea what the hell they were doing.
But might it be the reason that we cannot stop funding Ukraine right now because we don't have any idea of what it would mean that they come to a peace deal with Russia?
Yeah, let it go. Stop it. And then what we should do...
But maybe we don't have an idea at all, and that's the reason why we just continue.
Well, I think there are plenty of people who recognize that we have to help Ukraine with humanitarian assistance and help them find their own way. But they have to make their peace with the Russians. And more important, Berlin and Warsaw and Vilnius and all the capitals in Eastern Europe, they all need to make their peace with Russia. They have to have a pact, much like the one that we signed that created Austrian neutrality. Eisenhower, by the way, was very happy with neutrality. Initially, he was worried about it. Then when he looked at it, he said, not only should we neutralize Austria, let's see if we can neutralize Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and say, this is great.
But it's interesting. You mentioned the capitals of the different nations. You're not mentioning NATO.
No, because NATO, I think NATO is... Not only has it long since outlived its usefulness and utility, I'm sure somebody in Washington would like to use that facade to legitimate itself. I think NATO is illegitimate. It has long since overreached. It has become a cause of war, not the preventive measure that it was supposed to be.
Is it like in the times of Athens that in fact they needed the enemy Sparta? That NATO needed the enemy Russia to legitimize itself.
Oh, I think that was the attitude. And remember, given what these ruling,
but then you also can understand that that it wasn't allowed to, or it wasn't for the West. It wasn't for the powers that were at the time. It wasn't a good idea that Russia would join NATO, because then.
Yeah, there's no enemy to force cohesion on the alliance.
Exactly.
But no one in Washington believed in the notion that NATO could maintain peace, which is what most European officers that I dealt with thought NATO could do. They all saw NATO as a means of ensuring and guaranteeing peace on the continent. We did the opposite with it. We repurposed it for our own interests. But remember, you've got to also look at the ruling elites in Europe that want NATO or want to preserve it at all costs, even if it's the destruction of Europe, and the elites in Washington who are ready to sacrifice everything in Europe for their interests. What are they doing internally? These same ruling elites they have wrought destruction in Europe. They have wrought destruction in the United States.
You can say that's a different kind of war that is going on. And I think it's not...
But if you can't fight the Russians... What do you do about that?
And it's interesting because we have this other notion also in the United States of cultural war. And that's, I think that's, and on a more profound level, we're dealing with this cultural war right now.
Well, when I left my job at Shape, and they were very nice to me, we had a dinner and so forth. There were probably 100 people there, maybe 80, 90, somewhere like that. And I said, there's a reason why we're here, we Americans. Because if water is purest at its source, Europe is the fountainhead of our civilization. That's all.
Yeah.
Nothing about destroying other people's civilizations or making war on them. Nothing saying other people's civilizations are bad, simply recognizing this is where everything began. It deserves to survive. It should flourish.
Yeah. It's like cultivating your heritage.
Yeah. And it's in your interest, it's in our interest. That's why we're here.
Yeah.
Well, of course, I left hoping that business in Kosovo was the end. What a fool I was. The maniacs that brought us into combat in the Balkans against the people there, and the Russians, the Serbs are there in the forefront of driving us into conflict with people all over the Middle East, people in Asia. It's insane. It needs to stop. But how do you get people to understand the criticality of demilitarizing our relations with most of the world? Because these people that are in charge have convinced everybody that the people we want to demilitarize our relations with are the enemy. What if you sat up and say, no, the Russians aren't the enemy, the Chinese aren't the enemy. Oh, the Chinese are bad. Well, these people have never been in Northeast Asia. They don't understand Asians. They don't understand. Nobody in Asia wants a war.
We're coming to a close of our very profound conversation and your very deep analysis. Maybe just to get back to some central issues. Eisenhower said after the Second World War that the military-industrial complex was a danger to the future of America. We talked about globalization. We talked about the important role of politics, economy, and technology, and of course, you can also say the financial powers within this whole structure are huge. There are a lot of very industrial powers also at work, promoting certain actions, promoting also military interventions. You talk about Washington D.C., in which the lobbyists are active. Because the networks that rule the country, rule the world in a certain sense, but also the powers now that some within the different populations in America and in Europe that are formulating their discontent with what goes on, and we call it the rise of populism, but I think that's only a way to discredit, disqualify what goes on. But now you started your own movement or organization, Our Country, Our Choice.
Well, I didn't start it.
You didn't start it, but
they brought me in.
They brought you in,
and the people that began this and created it, some of whom are not native-born Americans, but very fierce Americans, were concerned about all the issues that we discussed. And they wanted something that they thought could... As an alternative. Yeah, as an alternative to the status quo, in the sense that these are people that looked at the Republicans and Democrats and said, this is a show. This is no longer real. This is a uniparty.
Yeah.
It's just a jockeying for position to decide how to redistribute wealth and power.
Yeah, but the interesting thing, when I look at it from the outside, then it seems that there's such a real antagonism between the two, and people really hating each other, and the Trumpists and the MAGA Americans against the others, and now you say, well, this is in fact not the real issue.
Yeah, that's a show.
That's a show.
Yeah, you have to understand that if you look carefully at, for instance, the last piece of legislation that finally passed through the House and the Senate, sending 60+ billion to Ukraine, 8, 9, 10, 14, 15 billion to Israel, which of course is the tip of a very big iceberg. and money to Taiwan, of all places. Where's the money for the defense of the border? Where are the forces, the troops that we can commit to defend our borders?
Okay, but you can hear a lot of Republicans saying that.
Yeah, there's nothing there. And we say a lot of Republicans, they talk a great game, but of the group that we call Republicans, there are only perhaps 18 to 20.
The governor of Texas was...
What's he done?
Yeah.
He has enormous authority.
Yeah.
Our state constitutions, and particularly Texas, he could have long ago committed the National Guard there and said, you're going to stop everybody coming in. And if the federal government wants to come down here and shoot at us, I invite them to try. But that's true in every state. What was the opposition? None. No one stood up and said no. Look at the poor people in the Border Patrol. They're committing suicide, several of them, because they can't do their jobs. They're watching everything they worked for being destroyed. Look at the criminality across the country and these district attorneys who've been elected or appointed thanks to Soros money to ensure that the criminals are released and the police are prosecuted. I mean, the thing is out of control. The country's out of control. And what are we worried about? Ukraine? Israel? Israel is a very powerful state. I think when all is said and done, we're going to discover that what happened on the 7th of October was not an accident. And there was this plan to then go after all of the Arabs inside Israel, drive them out or kill them. Now, there are a lot of people in this country that don't like Muslims and don't like Arabs. They don't deserve to die. I certainly don't think so. Why are we underwriting this? This is not defense.
But to get back to this.
Yeah, but I think you got to go to Ukraine too and look at the money there. Where did most of the money go? Back here. It's laundered through the House, and it ends up going through the Pentagon and State Department, and then ultimately into the industry. So most of the money never leaves. But the money that does go to Ukraine is lost in this sea of corruption. How much of it actually reaches the battlefront? And so now we have NATO forces, NATO officers, NCOs, contractors from Western countries operating the long-range strike systems because the Ukrainians can't do it. And it creates the illusion that there's still something left of Ukraine. We have whole units surrendering to the Russians. And remember, the people in eastern Ukraine, they all understand Russian. So do the people in the West. They can understand. Anyone who's Ukrainian can understand what the Russians are saying. The Russians can understand that.
What's the way out? Our country, our choice is an alternative.
Our position is stop funding this. Stop funding the wars. Put an end to it. Bring the troops home. We need protection here. Yeah. We need to protect our own country. We need to focus on the Western Hemisphere. We treat Latin America with abject neglect. Are we surprised that?
But it would imply a kind of a revolution right now.
Well, we need it. We need that, and we can do it peacefully.
And because we were talking about these elites, we're talking about this complex networks. I mean, you're not simply rid of them when you change the political color.
I think what happens is two things. I think you're going to see this in Europe too. Americans are going to vote, assuming we hold an election. You don't know what can happen financially in this country and economically, given the very tenuous and fragile structure. But if we get to the election and they vote, and it's even remotely clean voting, in other words, we can overcome the fraud, which is substantial in all the big cities. If that can be overcome, you're going to end up with a new government. Now, will that be President Trump? Maybe it's President Trump. It could be somebody else. I don't know. I don't think RFK Jr. is positioned very well at the moment. But it's certainly not going to be the same people who are there now. It'll be a different government. What can they accomplish? And we're not sure. How easy is it to subvert the people coming in? We found out that President Trump was thoroughly subverted during his 4 years. People say, oh, well, things were great then. What he did was very little. He stopped a lot of bad things from happening. It could have been worse. But fundamentally, he's president of the United States. If he'd come to office and said in the first 30 days, I want the border closed, sign an executive order, it would have been closed. It would have been absolutely barricaded. He could have put troops down. They could have done any number of things. It didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? And now he says, well, when I was there, it was so much better. Well, it was better, but it wasn't enough. It's never been enough. The Republicans have been...
So you're saying it's more rhetoric?
Yes. And right now they're going to get into office and they're going to encounter tremendous entrenched bureaucracy. They're going to encounter all sorts of people with huge quantities of money who will fight them. So how far are they going to get? The question is, how far could a new government in France get? Or the Netherlands, or Germany initiative. And what I think happens over time is people say, that's enough. We can't go this way anymore. And that's when you end up with what I would call a Cromwellian revolution. Because it became clear, despite every effort that went on for years to cooperate with the king, to work with the king, to work with the leadership, the aristocrats, it didn't work. Finally had to come in and say, it's over. They've got to go. And Cromwell established a republic.
And that's where your militaristic background comes.
Yeah, but he had to establish a republic. And he and George Washington are very much alike. And as I tell people all the time, you want to understand American history, it does not begin in 1776. It begins with Cromwell. And from Cromwell, all of those Puritans that came in, there were large numbers of people in New England went back to fight for it.
You know, I live in Leiden. And there's a famous, because the Mayflower went, and the Puritans fled to Leiden, lived there for some time, and then...
on my mother's side, they were Quakers. They became Quakers after the Cromwellian Revolution because they were horrified at the violence. And they had fought for Cromwell. And they said, we don't want to do that again. And they became Quakers. I mean, Americans have deep roots, and it begins with Cromwell. It goes to George Washington, who is very Cromwellian in his outlook and behavior, even when he becomes president, he's very much the Lord Protector. He's a dictator. And everybody loves him because he's a good dictator. But he gets us on our feet. He sets us up. And then he goes away. And then you get a series of presidents that follow in his footsteps. And eventually it falls apart, and we get Lincoln. And you draw that line from Cromwell through Washington all the way to Lincoln, and Lincoln puts it back together again, changes the orientation, and we go forward. We're going to have to go through another Lincolnian, Washingtonian, Cromwellian moment at some point. I really think we will. I don't know when, how, or what.
Like a next great awakening.
But we have to bring the country together. We have to forge a new nation from what we...
But it has a spiritual dimension as well, of course. That's why I mentioned a great awakening. It's like a turnaround.
And you always see in these events, we were talking about this earlier in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the resurgence of spirituality and religion with the Muslims, with the Orthodox Christians, with the Roman Catholics. And this is a necessary stage, and it's never permanent. Because if you go back and you read Anatomy of Revolution by Crane Britton, he taught at Harvard, he gets some things right and wrong. He gets the Bolshevik Revolution completely wrong. But he gets the Cromwellian Revolution right and the French Revolution right. And he asks all the key questions. When do they happen? Why do they happen? And what happens? How do they evolve? And within 5-6 years of the French Revolution breaking out, what do? You migrate back to the middle. In other words, you shift to an extreme to fix things, and then you go back to the middle. And that's what we did. That's what Cromwell did. You go to the extreme, and then you migrate back to the middle again. I'm very confident that a republic will emerge, a new republic that'll be different from the one we have. But it will have the Bill of Rights, which is really what we fight for. It's the Bill of Rights that defines us. As Americans, I think our lodestone, the thing we follow, the North Star, the true north for us, is the Bill of Rights. And the Constitution is a wonderful document, but there will be changes, inevitably. I mean, we're not the nation today that we were in 1787, and it's done very well for us. How much of it will change, I don't know, but the Bill of Rights is critical. They must stay. That's what makes us a successful nation. And the erosion of that through this authoritarian globalism. You don't agree with us, we put you in jail. You don't support our version of climate change, you lose your job. You refuse to, subscribe to our view of the world. You oppose what's being done to agriculture in your country. You don't like what's happening. You go to jail. The police will come and arrest you. It's terrible in England. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. People are being put in jail simply for expressing their views. Free speech is the antidote to tyranny. It's vital. It's an uncompromising position. Just because it offends someone is not justification for suppressing it. Yeah. And then we have the Second Amendment. which is part of the Bill of Rights, the right to bear arms, which, of course, the globalists hate. But without that amendment, all the others fall apart. It's the fact that we are all armed that ensures the Bill of Rights will survive.
Yeah, that is a difference in Europe, of course. I would like to thank you very much for this conversation, Doug. It was really illuminating. It made me think, especially the last part of it, of this famous quote from the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, who lived in the 6th and the 6th century before Christ. And it's one of his, I think, the most famous quotes, in which he says, "Polemos pater panton estin." The war is the father of all things, king of all things. He renders some gods, some men. He makes some free, some a slave. And in the last part, we were talking, in fact, about this cultural war that is raging, and it's the more profound level, I think, of the things we're witnessing on television, and this war that is raging in the West, in which we have to look at ourselves and reinvent ourselves or refine ourselves in a way. And I think your reflections are part of this bigger cultural movement we're in. So thank you very much for welcoming me here in this studio and for this inspiring conversation.
Well, thank you for coming so far to talk to me. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
All the best.